Okay, today is chapter 8 of The Pharaohs of Ancient Egypt by Elizabeth Payne. The chapter is titled The Beginning of the End, Pharaoh Ramses II. This covers from about 1291 BC to about 1224 BC. With Pharaoh Haramhab's death, the long and brilliant 18th dynasty came to an end. After the turbulent years under Akhenaton, Egypt had returned to her old ways, her old art forms, and her old gods. Akhenaton and his Aton were all but forgotten, though the valley people still superstitiously averted their eyes as they passed the crumbling city of the horizon on their way up or down the river. Haramhab died without heirs, and the throne passed to his vizier Ramses, the first pharaoh of the 19th dynasty. He and his son Seti devoted themselves primarily to valley affairs, and it was not until Seti's son, Ramses II, mounted the throne that Egypt once again turned her eyes seriously toward empire. Ramses II was crowned pharaoh in about 1291 BC. He was 18 years old and looked very much a god king, every inch a god king. Tall for an Egyptian, he was handsome, slim, and athletic. His father, by all accounts, had made him run 2 miles before breakfast every morning. Right after his coronation, Ramses journeyed upriver beyond the first cataract to Abu Simbel, where he was later to build one of the most famous temples in Egypt. From Abu Simbel, he came down the Nile on the rising flood as though he himself were bringing the swollen, life-giving waters to his people. Ramses paid his respects to the high priest of Ammon at Thebes, and from there he proceeded slowly downriver to the delta, showing himself majestically to his people on the way. And then Pharaoh prepared to reconquer Egypt's vast empire, so sadly disintegrated under Akhenaton's rule. Nubia was still under Egyptian control, but the Hittites had by this time taken most of North Syria and were penetrating southward into Palestine. During the first 4 years of his reign, Ramses campaigned along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, retaking the coastal cities so necessary to him as bases. And for 4 years, the wily Hittites watched him and waited. Then they pounced. As Ramses was mapping out his 5th year's campaign, couriers from the north stumbled into Pharaoh's court with alarming news. Mutuwalis, king of the Hittites, had gathered together a vast army of allies. He was now marching south toward the Syrian city of Kadesh, preparing to take Egypt's remaining vassal states away from her. The enemy, said the couriers, numbered at least 30,000 and filled the whole land, covering the hills and valleys like locusts. This is one of the many enormous statues of Pharaoh Ramses II that fill the interior of his temple at Abu Simbel. Ramses did not hesitate. His army was ready and waiting, a force of 20,000 soldiers and charioteers. They were divided into 4 divisions of 5,000 men each and marched under the standards of Egypt's 4 greatest gods, Ammon, Ra, Ta, and Sutek. At the head of the division of Ammon, and with his tame lion loping along beside his chariot, Ramses marched out of Egypt onto the great coastal road, leading north, the road Thutmose III had taken some 200 years earlier. 29 days after he left the Egyptian frontier, Pharaoh reached the heights overlooking the valley of Kadesh. Below him lay a wide plain, divided from north to south by the river Orontes. The city of Kadesh was just visible in the distance, some 10 miles up the valley. There was no sign of an enemy encampment beneath its walls, and the valley itself lay quiet and still in the late afternoon sunlight. There was not a Hittite soldier in sight. Ramses was not surprised. For days, his advance scouts had reported no sign of the enemy. In their opinion, Mutuwalis and his forces were still far to the north. In perfect confidence, Ramses camped in the mountains that night and the next morning descended onto the plain. As he was about to ford the river, 2 Hittite deserters were brought before him. Mutuwalis, they said, had been in the valley not long before, but he had fled north at news of Pharaoh's coming. The enemy king was now sitting in the distant city of Aleppo, too frightened to engage the mighty army of Egypt. Pleased and flattered with this news, Ramses decided to take the undefended city of Kadesh before moving north. Fording the river, he set out up the valley with his personal bodyguard and the division of Ammon. The division of Ra, well to the rear, was just coming down from the heights. The other 2 divisions had not yet left camp. Ramses marched along with no sense of impending danger. The sun shone brightly. The river sparkled, and the balmy air was full of the sounds and smells of spring. There was no one reason to be seen in the quiet valley, and Ramses had no reason to suspect that he was walking right into a trap. At midday, Pharaoh arrived beneath the forbidding walls and barred gates of Kadesh. He ordered his troops to make camp and summoned his officers and scouts for a conference. And then disaster struck. The Hittite deserters at the river crossing had actually been spies sent to deceive Ramses about the enemy's whereabouts. Mutuwalis was not sitting in distant Aleppo at all. He and his army of 30,000 were hiding on the other side of Kadesh. And now, with the shock of a thunderclap, the Hittite chariotry broke from behind the city walls. Ignoring Ramses for the moment, they galloped down the valley to cut off the division of Ra, which was coming up some 2 miles back. Caught completely off guard, half the Ra division retreated in disorder. The other half fled desperately up the valley to Pharaoh's camp, the Hittite charioteers hard on their heels. In their panic, the remnants of the Ra division surged straight through camp and beyond, carrying most of the bewildered and terror-stricken division of Ammon with them. Ramses, as he later told the story, was left alone. To face 2,500 Hittite charioteers, with only his personal bodyguard to help him. As the enemy closed in around him, Pharaoh managed to send off a message to the divisions of Ta and Sutek, ordering them to advance to his aid with all speed. They turned to face the Hittites. Leaping into his chariot, he tied the reins around his waist to leave his hands free. He lifted up his head, sent forth a great cry for help to Ammon in distant Thebes, and charged. The ring of chariots around Pharaoh was weakest along the riverbank, and it was here that Ramses attacked. 6 times he hurled his chariot against the Hittites, so successfully that he drove them into the river like crocodiles. King Mutuwalis, in the meantime, had come out from behind Kadesh with a force of 8,000 infantrymen. He stood watching the fight from the opposite bank of the Orontes River. The river, according to Ramses, was now churning with thrashing horses and drowning men, and King Mutuwalis stood, averted, shrinking, and afraid at the sight. Turning to fight the other Hittite charioteers, Ramses found his arm so strengthened by Ammon that 2,500 spans of chariotry, in whose midst I was, became heaps of corpses before my horses. Be that as it may, the unequal contest could not go on. Ramses was caught in a desperate trap, and he would have been captured or killed in a matter of moments had it not been for 3 unexpected developments. First, the fleeing divisions of Ammon and Ra had abandoned Pharaoh's camp with its stacked armaments, its tethered horses, its unhitched golden chariots, its royal pavilion, and Ramses' golden throne. At sight of all this booty, most of the Hittite charioteers wheeled away from Ramses, leapt to the ground, and fell to looting. Second, a contingent of Egyptian allies arrived unexpectedly on the scene. having come inland from the coast to rendezvous with Pharaoh in the valley. They flung themselves on the looting Hittites, and they were soon joined by the soldiers of Ammon and Ra, who had recovered from their panic and returned to the fight. Third, for some inexplicable reason, King Mudawallis did not throw his 8,000 infantry into the battle. He and his soldiers remained where they were during their entire struggle, watching as spectators from the other side of the river. The battle raged on during the long afternoon. Then, towards sunset, the standard of the division of Ta was seen through the dust and confusion. This division, its soldiers rested and fresh, turned the tide of the battle. Not long after they arrived on the scene, the Hittite chariotry fled in disorder, and Mudawallis retreated to safety within the walls of Kadesh. Ramses did not wait to lay siege to the city or to face Mudawallis in battle again. Gathering together the remnants of his 4 divisions, he turned tail and retreated to Egypt. Once back in the Nile Valley, Ramses claimed for himself a stupendous victory against the enemy, while he was alone, having no army with him. Pharaoh said, he had repelled all lands through terror of him, so that all foreign countries were giving praise to his goodly countenance. But, in truth, the Battle of Kadesh was no victory at all. Ramses had walked into a trap, had lost great numbers of his army, had failed to capture Kadesh, and had neither defeated the Hittites decisively nor driven them north into their own lands again. And yet, as Egyptologist John Wilson said, there is no episode in Egyptian history that occupies so much carved wall space in Egyptian temples as Ramses' account of his great personal triumph in the Battle of Kadesh. In fact, when archaeologists first started to work in Egypt, they not only found Ramses' account of the battle depicted on temple walls up and down the valley, they also, it seemed to them, found his name carved on most of the monuments, steles, and obelisks in the land, concluding that Ramses must have been the mightiest of ancient Egypt's pharaohs. The archaeologists named him Ramses the Great. Later, they somewhat sheepishly revised their opinion, for they discovered that Ramses had gone up and down the Nile, appropriating the monuments of his predecessors and carving his name over theirs. Ramses was not so much a mighty pharaoh as a mighty egoist and self-publicizer. After the Battle of Kadesh, Ramses continued to campaign each year against the Hittites in Syria and Palestine. Towns were captured by the Egyptians, recaptured by the Hittites, and taken again by the Egyptians. Over the years, the two armies fought each other to a standstill. At last, weary of the long drawn-out conflict, the warring nations signed a treaty of peace. Here's a relief of Ramses smiting the Asiatics. This is one of the many portrayals of the pharaoh's battle with the Hittites that appear on temple walls up and down the Nile Valley. The pact was never broken. Its continuing success was celebrated 16 years later by a great state marriage between Ramses and the daughter of the Hittite king. The little princess made her way down into Egypt with a vast retinue of courtiers, ladies in waiting, and soldiers. They were followed by strings of fine horses, herds of cattle, and cartloads of gold and silver. Her dowry for her future husband. Pharaoh sent an imposing escort to meet his bride, and as it was recorded at the time, the daughter of the great prince of Hatti marched to Egypt, while the infantry, chariotry, and officials of his majesty accompanied her, mingling with the infantry and chariotry of Hatti. They ate and drank together, being of one heart like brothers, for peace and brotherhood were between them. Pharaoh awaited the princess in his pillared throne room, where she was at last brought before him. He saw that she was fair of face, like a goddess. She was beautiful in the heart of his majesty, and he loved her more than anything. Pharaoh's little Hittite bride was not only his wife. Ramses outlived 7 great royal wives and an untold number of secondary wives and concubines. By them all he had at least 100 sons and more than 50 daughters, a vast palace full of royal children. Ramses had been born in the Delta. He loved its wide wind-swept meadows, its winding waterways, and its wine sweeter than honey. So it was here, soon after he came to the throne, that Pharaoh began building his new capital, which he called Tanis. Thebes, from this time on, became primarily a religious center. The new capital, like the old, was thronged with foreigners and with natives come to reside near the sun, their pharaoh. The city hummed with life, and its warehouses bulged with goods from Punt, Syria, Crete, the Aegean Islands, and Cyprus. When Ramses was not in residence in his magnificent palace, which glittered with turquoise, gold, and lapis lazuli, he voyaged up and down river, overseeing his many building projects along the Nile. He constructed the temple of Abu Simbel above the first cataract with its giant statues of himself before the portals. He completed the famous Hypostyle Hall at Karnak with its forest of pillars so big around that 100 men could stand atop each. He built temple after temple, often with stones from the former pharaoh's buildings. Right here are 4 giant statues of Ramses, each nearly 70 feet tall, and they guard the entrance to the temple of Abu Simbel in Upper Egypt, which he pulled down and carted away for his own use. He even braved superstition and made off with marble and granite blocks from Akhenaton's crumbling city of the horizon, using them to build a temple across the river. Ramses died at the age of 85 after ruling Egypt for 67 long years. On the surface, the valley seemed more prosperous and stable than ever, but a closer look revealed unmistakable signs that Egypt's great days were coming to an end. The valley was in fact beginning a slow and melancholy decline into the sorry breakdown of its old age. Egypt's decline was in part caused by a great folk wandering that was now taking place in the ancient world. Long before Amenhotep III's day, tribes of land-hungry people had begun to trickle out of the vast, unknown regions north of the Black Sea, driving their herds and flocks before them. These peoples fanned out over the ancient world. They moved down into the Tigris and Euphrates Valley and into the land that later would be called Persia. They infiltrated Asia Minor and pushed down into the mountainous peninsula of Greece. Some journeyed far overland to Italy, where they founded a little trading post on the Tiber River, which they named Rome. History has called these peoples the Indo-Europeans, but to the ancient Egyptians, they were known as the northerners of the islands or the peoples of the sea. For once they had reached the coast, many of these wanderers built themselves sleek, sharp-prowed boats and ranged the Mediterranean like hungry pirates. During the reigns of Akhenaton and Haremhab and of Ramses I and II, the trickle of wandering tribes from the north had grown into a tidal wave. The sea peoples crossed the Mediterranean and settled in Libya on Egypt's western frontiers. They rolled down through Syria and Palestine, crushing the Hittites as they passed. And 75 years after the death of Ramses II, they were at the very gates of Egypt herself. Pharaoh Ramses III fought them off by land and sea. He kept the wanderers from invading the rich lands of the Delta. But by the end of his reign, in about 1147 BC, the sea peoples had taken over Egypt's last holdings in Palestine. The people in the Nile Valley withdrew behind their own borders. Their days as the greatest nation of the ancient world had come to an end forever. For the next several centuries, Egypt turned this way and that, trying like a boar at bay to ward off invasion by the young and aggressive nations coming to power all about her. But it was a losing battle. The peoples of the great folk wandering were too many and too strong, and more importantly, the very heart seemed to have gone out of the valley people themselves. This is a few of the gigantic columns that make up the famous Hypostyle Hall at Karnak, constructed by Ramses II. The Egyptians had never been a warlike people by nature. They had first gone to battle under Ahmose to rid their land of the hated Hyksos, and in an upsurge of national pride, they had willingly fought to win Thutmose III his empire. But then they had hired foreign mercenary or professional soldiers to fight their battles for them. And the valley people had turned to the comfort and security of jobs in the priesthood or in the vast civil service and the empire demanded. During the rich and luxurious years, when they controlled much of the ancient world, the Egyptians had grown so soft and complacent, so used to success and so set in their ways that they now had neither the will to fight off the sea peoples nor the flexibility to adapt themselves to the rapidly changing world around them. Even so, the Egyptians might have enjoyed a peaceful and dignified old age in their valley, had all gone well with them there. But even nature seemed to conspire against Pharaoh's people. Not long after the death of Ramses III, Egypt suffered a series of disastrously low floods. Famine was severe. The starving people robbed and scavenged for food. And there was widespread dishonesty and theft among the highest government officials. It was during this time that tomb robbery became an open and almost accepted profession. With the connivance of guards and officials, the people systematically plundered the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, stealing the riches there to barter for food. Strong and forceful pharaohs might have been able to relieve Egypt's economic distress and restore order to the land, but Ramses III was succeeded by a long line of petty kings, one weaker than the last. Under these ineffectual rulers, the Egyptians gradually began to lose their once deep-seated faith in the divine authority of Pharaoh. He began to seem less a god to them than a weak and foolish mortal, lacking dignity, authority, or strength. Hand in hand with this loss of faith in the divinity of Pharaoh, which had been in great measure responsible for the stability and character of Egyptian society, went a growing cynicism about Egypt's great gods. The stories and songs of the period burlesque and caricature Pharaoh and the gods in a way that would have been unthinkable under Thutmose or Amenhotep or even Ramses II. Thus, the political and economic distress in Egypt after Ramses III's death was deepened by a kind of spiritual collapse among the valley people. The great days of the empire were gone. Unrest, disorder, and dishonesty were rampant in the valley, and the Egyptian people had grown increasingly uncertain and cynical about the very things they held sacred for more than 2,000 years. In their troubled state, they relied ever more heavily on witchcraft, omens, demonology, and oracles to solve their problems, and they shrank from the tumultuous and changing world around them. In their tired and spiritless old age, the valley people gave themselves over to dreaming of their glorious past, when, as it now seemed to them, the Egyptian world had been ordered, serene, and indestructible. Disintegration within Egypt was so rapid that some 75 years after the death of Ramses III, the valley had fallen into two separate kingdoms again. This further weakened Egypt's military, and it was not long before the wretched foreigner once more ruled their land. Disordered and helpless Egypt was governed for a time by pharaohs of Libyan descent, and then by a dynasty of invading Nubians. The downhill slide became precipitous. In 670 BC, the bloodthirsty Assyrians overran the valley. They were followed in 525 BC by invading hordes of Persians, and then came young Alexander the Great. In 332 BC, he and his world-conquering army of Macedonians and Greeks marched into Egypt, drove out the Persians, and laid claim to the Nile Valley for themselves. From time to time, during the long years of foreign occupation, a native Egyptian prince seized the throne and ruled the valleys as pharaoh for a brief time. But with the coming of Alexander the Great, Egypt's history as an independent country came to an end forever. Alexander founded the city of Alexandria in the western delta, and he left one of his most trusted generals, a Macedonian nobleman named Ptolemy, to govern Egypt, while he marched off to win the Eastern world. When Alexander died a few years later, Ptolemy seized the throne and placed the sacred double crown on his own head. For the next 300 years, his descendants ruled the valley as Greek pharaohs. And then came the turn of Rome. Queen Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies, committed suicide as Augustus Caesar and his formidable Roman legions marched into the Delta in 30 BC. For the following 700 years, Egypt served as Rome's breadbasket, supplying corn to feed both the far-flung Roman legions and the citizens of the world's new capital on the Tiber River in Italy. Then Rome's power too declined. In AD 641, the Arabs, rampaging through the Near East in the name of their prophet Muhammad, seized Egypt for themselves. In 1517, the country was conquered once again, this time by the empire-building Turks. The Nile Valley remained under Turkish rule until young Napoleon Bonaparte and his French troops landed at Alexandria in 1798. Almost 200 years have passed since Napoleon and his scholars rediscovered the land of the ancient pharaohs. Since then, archaeologists have given the world a wondrous picture of Egypt's civilization in the great days before her decline. And inspired by discoveries made in the Nile Valley, other excavators have fanned out over the Near East to dig up the cities and histories of Egypt's ancient friends and enemies. The ruins of Babylon have been found in the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. In central Turkey, archaeologists have discovered the buried city of Bogaz Koy, capital of the ancient Hittites. On Crete, the great palace of Knossos was found beneath a hill where olive trees blew in the wind. And far to the north, the intrepid Heinrich Schliemann discovered the site of ancient Troy, where Greeks and Trojans fought their most famous war during the time of Ramses III. Historians often call these ancient cultures dead civilizations, but archaeologists would not agree, for there are still many gaps in their knowledge of ancient Egypt and her world, and there are still many known areas to be excavated in Egypt and the Near East, to say nothing of unknown sites still to be discovered, and of the exciting accidental finds of archaeology. In 1954, for example, a group of Arab workmen were building a new tourist road around the Great Pyramid of Giza. Not 25 yards from the base of the pyramid, and in-ground archaeologists thought held no more secrets for them, the workmen uncovered a line of huge stone blocks. Beneath them lay a full-sized wooden ship. It had been buried with Pharaoh Cheops 5,000 years earlier, so that his spirit could sail up and down the Nile after death, as the pharaoh had done during his lifetime. And so, until every possible scrap of evidence has been found and evaluated, the civilizations of Egypt and the ancient Near East are very much alive to the archaeologists. Their exciting and painstaking work continues, and scarcely a month goes by that the newspapers of the world do not report a new find, large or small, somewhere in the Nile Valley or in the ancient lands that bounded its world.